In this video, we're going to take some observations about the Johannine Ethics and some of the metaphors and images and concepts that are used to express the ethical principles that we find in the Gospel of John as well as the letters of John. So first of all, focusing here on the Johannine is really a family ethics, and what we mean here by this is that family is described, the concept of family is described in language like fellowship and communion. And so, of course, in the early church, they did use the kind of kinship language of brothers to describe one another, brothers, sisters, to describe this kind of family relationship, this fictive kinship that is created by those who are believers in Jesus. And so, in particular, in John's gospel, we see this language of fellowship or communion describe them. Of course, God is described as Father, and Jesus is Son, and this too is family language. Believers are described as children who have been brought about by a new birth through the Spirit based on belief in Jesus. So again, we're getting this language here to describe the community as a family, and because they are a family, there are certain kind of expectations about how members of that family ought to live. So part of what they do is they dwell or abide together, and so there's this language tries to describe a sense of loyalty, so that believers are supposed to be loyal to each other. And this is, of course, only possible because of the oneness that they have with Jesus, and because Jesus has a oneness with the Father. So because Jesus and the Father are one, because believers abide or dwell with Jesus, they are connected to him, therefore what's been created here is this type of family unit. Now, of course, there's other language that's used in the Gospel of John to talk about this abiding or dwelling, like, for instance, the vine language, to think about each, family is, each member is part of a group that is like a branch of the vine. But the language of dwelling and abiding also conveys this concept of living together, and that's what the Christian family is supposed to be about. Now, this family partakes in divine honor as they walk in light and love. So the language about walking is about type of moral transformation. So one does not simply just become something at the moment of belief, but there is a moral transformation that is going to take place as one continues to walk in the light, since Jesus is the light, and as people continue to walk in love for one another, because this is a love that is expressed by Jesus for his disciples, and it is a love that is expressed between the Father and the Son. So together, the way in which people are supposed to think about how they act are supposed to be rooted or founded in this concept of being a family. So just like most families have certain type of traditions, customs, values that distinguish them from other family groups, so too this Christian family has behaviors. The Gospel of John letters don't go into great details about what those behaviors are, but it's centered around the confession of who Jesus is, and it's also describing how they will relate to each other, how they will stay loyal to each other, how they will serve each other. So another ethics concept we find in this material is the idea of learning ethics by Jesus' example. So in the ancient world, it was common to expect children or disciples to learn the good life, the best life, happiness, not only from their parents' and teachers' instructions, but also by observing their life. There's a special word that's oftentimes used to describe this, mimesis, mimesis. So this describes learning from example. And so you see how a person who is perceived as living the good life or the happy life, well balanced life, and then you learn by observing what it is that they do. Aristotle advocated in his Ethics about a character friendship, and this is in which people copied, not simply mimicking. You're not doing exactly what the other person does, but you're seeing what someone else does, and then you attempt to interpret and then imitate that. And so by interpreting, you're seeing what it is a person does and kind of understanding why they do that. And then when you have analogous situations, not exactly the same situations, but something that you can perceive as similar, then you take actions in accordance with what you have seen your teacher or your parents do. And of course, we know this as well from observations about most people's families or lives. People tend to behave in line with the way in which their parents behave, or maybe sometimes in a attitude of wanting to be exactly opposite of what their parents is. But in the ancient world, you're supposed to behave in a good family. You're supposed to behave like the behaviors of your family, your parents. Now, Jesus' washing of his disciples' feet in John 13 is done as an example for his disciples of humble service. And so the example in John 13 is not intended to be, okay, I've washed the disciples' feet, so now you need to replicate or mimic this exact action. You need to be washing each other's feet. The act of washing feet is both in John's Gospel a symbol of Jesus' self-sacrificing for the good of others in his death on the cross. But it is also an act of service, of humility, and taking care of needs that other people will have. And so when Jesus says to his disciples to do as he has done, not just do what I have done, but look at this service of humility, and then find ways of serving one another with that same type of humility. So this is an important ethical principle in the Johannine ethic of humble service, finding those ways, finding those needs within our family, with amongst our brothers and sisters in Christ, and trying to find out ways in which we might be able to address those needs. So in 1 John, disciples are urged to, quote, be like Jesus. And again, this idea of not mimicking Jesus, but again, looking at Jesus' overall life, seeing the ways in which he has behaved. Now, it is kind of curious to try and think, well, how would the early Christian communities know how to behave like Jesus when they did not see Jesus? And of course, there is a tradition about how Jesus behaved, and those traditions then get saved and eventually get incorporated into our gospel materials. Now, we don't know if how much of those gospels the Johannine community would have known. Maybe they would have known the Gospel of John, and therefore have seen the way in which Jesus interacts with different people, so with his opponents and with those who are kind of genuine seekers of truth, and how he's willing to teach them, how he's willing to interact with them in ways that are gracious and merciful, but sometimes as well in ways that are direct. So in that way, they can be like Jesus. Now, whether or not they had a gospel, say, for instance, the Gospel of Mark, we do not know for certain. But again, there would be traditions about the things that Jesus said, and again, stories about the things, how Jesus behaved with different individuals from which they could learn from. All right, so we've looked here now at two guiding principles. Make ethical choices, like you are a part of a special family, a family that has honor. That honor is because God is glorified. God has that honor, and therefore you don't want to dishonor the family. So you have to think about behaviors that might bring reproach upon the family. What does the family permit or allow or recognize? But also you've got the example of Jesus. And so what kinds of decisions reflect the type of decisions Jesus would make? Or are there decisions that we are making that we cannot imagine that Jesus would be making those decisions because they wouldn't be consistent with other things that he said or did? All right, we'll leave it at that for those two, and I'll do another video with some other concepts that we'll find in the Johannine epistles.